morning, Earthlings. We meet again. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Right, this video, let's talk about some stuff. Mostly I want to talk about Lord Lucan in this video. But just before that, thank you all very much for joining us on the very last minute and impromptu live last night with Trevor. I'm not going to comment any further on Trevor. If anybody wants to know what he said in his own words, you can go and watch the live. Very interesting developments though after the live. I noticed that his troll on X, whose main beef seems to be allegations against Trevor specifically, had a lot of sugars on there. Daisy, who claimed to me, has been following this troll account since the day it was born. That is interesting and adds a whole new dimension, don't you think? Something which I did suspect all along. I do believe there is a genuine person behind that troll account, but I don't think that that person realises what they're in up to their necks if they are involved with those sugars. Well, they'll find that out to their own cost, I'm sure. Also, one of the troll accounts, or this little sock puppets that follows it, said, why didn't I interrogate Trevor about specifics of any ongoing police investigation? Right, number one, I am not a police officer. Number two, YouTube, X, Twitter, or any social media for that matter is not a police interview room, and it is certainly not a court of law. So, Witchfinder Generals, the police are dealing with things, let them do their job. It is not for us on social media to be commenting one way or the other. And I now go on about Lord Lucan. Right. Who, of course, I'm pretty certain is not alive. And I've always had great interest and affection for both Veronica, the late Lady Lucan, and John Bingham. I've always had, and their children. I mean, how awful for the children. Can you imagine anything worse than, I mean, I know Veronica survived, but their whole family was just blown apart by terrible events that happened in 1974. I'm sure you all know the story. Lord Lucan is probably the most famous fugitive of all time. Now, my personal belief, and this is a lot of theorising on my part, I've done no more research than anybody else could do on the internet. I've watched lots of documentaries, interviews with Veronica, who again is sadly no longer with us. There is a current Lord Lucan, John's eldest son, and I do feel for him and his siblings and their children. And so I don't, you know, this is Fiona's imagination. Just check out everything I say because you all know I get stuff wrong. But it is a case that interests me. And it's my suspicion that Lord Lucan died that very night. And it is my suspicion that he never even left London. Okay, let's start there. Now, the theory is that, and the real victim here is Sandra Rivet, the nanny, who was murdered. So Lord and Lady Lucan are estranged. They've been in a custody battle for their children. He's rented an apartment. He's paying for his apartment and Lady Lucan's premises and, I think, Sandra Rivet's wages. The court had said they wanted a nanny to be present. And I think the children were wards of court, but the mother was looking after them at this stage. They're all in the house. I think it was a Thursday night, which would normally be the nanny's night off. And somebody broke into the house, murdered Sandra Rivet in the kitchen while Lady Lucan and her children were upstairs. Lady Lucan came downstairs, was attacked and escaped. She says it was her husband, John Bingham. She ran to the nearest pub to raise the alarm, right? John Bingham, when the police arrived, was not there. Lord Lucan, he disappeared. His mother said she'd received a telephone call from him to say could she go and collect the children. And then a witness said that he had visited a friend in Uckfield. And then they found a car at New Haven. And the theory is Lord Lucan had murdered the nanny, thinking it was Lady Lucan by mistake, then had tried to murder Lady Lucan, but she'd escaped. And he ultimately went and got across Channel Ferry from New Haven. Now, Lady Lucan, the last interview I saw, she believed he jumped off the ferry. Now, the major witness in this is Susan Maxwell Scott, who I believe has also passed away. So these are all people who are no longer with us, but it is an interesting case. And in my hypothetical world, if you were to take away Susan's testimony that Lucan visited her at her house in Uckfield that night, if you took that away, she's the last person who saw him alive. It's a very different looking story, isn't it? According to Lady Lucan, once John attacked her, she managed to calm him down, and he said, "Have you got any barbiturates?" And he went to go and get a glass of water from the bathroom, and that's when she escaped. So she was saying, yes, there were medications in the house, which in my imaginary world, right, and this is purely my imagination, and the reason I form this conclusion is having been a fugitive myself, and also being interested in Ronnie Biggs, another very famous fugitive. Ronnie, we heard from him again, on occasion, infrequently. Lord Lucan, not so much. Now, having been through those kind of circumstances myself, I know it is impossible. It is impossible after all these years that there is nothing, nada. Just newspapers saying there's a guy looks a bit like him, that we think that's him, or some dude claiming to be him. The truth of the matter is, Lord Lucan has not been seen or heard of since that night in 1974, which to me suggests he died that night, that very night, most likely in that house. Now, I haven't seen this particular documentary, but Graham did some more digging, and apparently Lady Lucan sold the main part of the house, but there was like a little mews cottage at the back of the garden, and she lived out her days there. She never left the property. Now, when people don't want to move out of a property, there can be a reason, especially why would you want to stay when something so awful had happened? It reminds me of a Columbo episode where it bothered the guy that the prime suspect he had a water fountain in the garden, but there was no water running, and it ultimately came out because they couldn't dig up the yard to put the plumbing in for water, and that's where this lady's, and she wouldn't sell, and she wouldn't move. Now that's a fictitious character, but it does interest me that Veronica lived out her days on that property. I believe one day in the future, it's a bit like Crippen, you know, everybody said, oh, Dr. Crippen, he was like a dirty word, he was a horror story for kids, and then other things have come to light to show that Dr. Crippen was most likely a victim himself. And I believe in the future, there's a possibility that a skeleton may be found at that property. And I don't know, 40, 50 years in the future, property development, I think it's a sort of restricted covenant kind of area. And people in the future will most likely be like, oh my God, all these years, the poor guy was accused of this, that and the other, and he was there in the ground all the time. So, I mean, but this is all my hypothetical theorising, and it is a case that I'm very, very interested in. Now, there are various ways something like that could play out, and you've got to remember this is the early 1970s, very unsophisticated police investigation, I would imagine. The crime scene had been horribly compromised, apparently. They were also Lord and Lady Lucan. They didn't just have the titles, they were a fabulously good-looking and somehow strange couple, because although, I mean, Veronica was devastatingly beautiful to her dying day at 80, and that's another thing I wanted to come to. I watched an interview with Veronica Lucan. I'll try and find it on YouTube and put a link in the description. She was interviewed, I think she was about 78 or 79. And when I saw that interview, that's really when I realised what might have actually happened that night. And Veronica subsequently, and very sadly, took her own life when she was 80. Now, the theory is she did that because she believed she had the onset of Parkinson's. I think she may have done that because she realised she'd said a little bit too much in that interview. And another thing is, it's very clear to me from that interview that Veronica adored him and that it was a passionate love affair, their whole marriage. They're very enigmatic people. They're really intriguing people, because when you see the famous photograph of the two of them looking very stoic, it makes you wonder what was going on. Now, Susan Maxwell Scott, I want to, not doing her down either, but it's not inconceivable in that world, in that network, where someone may, in a well-meaning way, agree to give evidence that they've seen something or heard something that they haven't, to try and help. And again, we're looking at very unsophisticated times. So perhaps somebody phoned Susan and said, can you do us a favour? Can you say you saw John tonight, but wait a few days until you tell the police? Because she did apparently wait a couple of days. So, I mean, again, the fact she waited. So let's put it this way, possibly, Veronica had an accomplice. That is not inconceivable. There are other things. Why did Lord Lucan go to the Claremont and say, has so-and-so been here, and then drive off in a fury? That was another witness testimony. You see these famous stories, they kind of go down a certain way and that's it, it's read, and nobody really wants to look into it. I would like to get hold of the coroner's report. I have tried before and it's not as easy as you think. I mean, I'm just not familiar with that type of thing. But there are an awful lot of questions. Witnesses who say they saw John Bingham at New Haven. Well, let's face it, an awful lot of people looked like Lord Lucan back in those days. He basically looked like Basil Fawlty. He had the moustache and very tweed jacket and all that. I mean, fabulous, really good looking guy. Very, very like there's friends with Lord Aspinall. And they were very cliquey set and very loyal friends. And I don't think it's inconceivable that Susan could have been persuaded to give some false evidence, to try and help. Certainly not in those days. And also police would have felt back in those days a little bit awkward about, you know, a little petite Lady Lucan being too hard on her. There are other instances in America, there are other famous cases where it's, you know, like the, it's not, the two Mrs. Grenvilles was a movie, wasn't it, that was based on Anne Woodward, and the fact that she shot her husband in the night, and again her mother-in-law sort of, they all grouped together and the police felt a little awkward to press as they would in normal circumstances. So I mean, just if in your imagination you look into the Lucan case and you take Susan out of the equation, the last person to see Lord Lucan alive would have been Veronica. And God knows what happened in that house that night. I suspect no one will ever really know until or unless a body or human remains are discovered. If you'd like me to look into it, I will try and get hold of a copy of the coroner's report. And I'm guessing a lot of you guys may remember things from back in the day. I was 4 years old when it happened. But it was a subject that kept coming up all the time and would be discussed around the breakfast table because my dad read the Daily Express. I know that because I always wanted the newspaper when he finished with it so I could colour in the little man with the shield and the sword. So I know he read the Express. I remember saying to him one morning, because I could see, as he was reading it, I could see the front page. And I said, Daddy, you're on the front page of the newspaper. There's two of you. And he went, what? And he looked and he hit the roof. It was the Cray twins. And he said, I don't look anything like the Cray twins. How dare you liken me to the Cray? Oh, I didn't know who the Cray twins were, but they all used to wear those kind of glasses, you know. My dad wore them. Oddly enough, he changed his frames after I'd said that. I just remembered that. But back in the day, people did. They dressed the same. They kind of looked the same. It was like a uniform, you know. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions and theories. And have a watch of the documentary of Veronica Bingham and tell me what you think. I mean, it's a very sad and tragic story, and as I say, especially for the surviving children. How just bloody awful for them, absolutely bloody awful. But I dare say, even they would want to get to the bottom of it, if for no other reason. Can you imagine, just to clear their father's name and say, well, we don't know what happened in the house, but can you imagine if any of his remains were to be found? As always, thank you all very much for listening. And as I say, thank you very much for joining us all on the live last night. I don't think I need to put a link in the description. Just go to my channel and watch it. Look forward to seeing you below.